Do you know what time it is? It's supernatural story time. And if you're easily scared, and even if you're not, there's only one thing left to do. Just turn off the lights, because these are stories that you listen to only in the dark.
True and Terrifying Stories, Volume 2. When I was 20, my girlfriend, now my ex, and I decided to take a week-long camping trip to some property that belonged to her father's friend with my Australian cattle dog, Wrangler, and her German Shepherd named Zero. About 4,000 acres undeveloped ranch in the northeast Texas woods. The plan was to be taken by four-wheeler to a point on the property unknown by us, and then we would hike back to the main gate over the next week. I had a GPS for an emergency, but we planned on doing the trip with maps and compass only. We were well equipped for the trip. I had enough food for 3 days, planned to hunt the rest, water for 3 days, and water purifying systems. All the necessary camping gear. She had her bolt-action .223 and a Taurus Judge. I had my .22 rifle and my .40 caliber Baby Eagle. We arrived at our destination and bid farewell to the friends that dropped us off on the four-wheelers. Our first day, we mainly wandered around exploring and figuring out our plan. There was a creek running through the property that we could follow, and it would get us pretty close to the gate. We had our plan and had done enough exploring, so we started setting up camp before dark. Our first night was very pleasant for the most part. Dinner by the fire with the dogs chit-chatting all night till about midnight. Then we decided to turn in. I woke up about 2:30 with a strange feeling. I saw Wrangler and Zero at the door of the tent, very tense, but not making a sound. I knew right away something was up. Both of these dogs were well trained and very loyal and protective of us. I stepped out with a light and the .40 to look around and left the dogs with my girlfriend just in case. She's a deep sleeper. I made my rounds around camp and found nothing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I passed it off as a pack of coyotes and went back to bed trusting the dogs to watch out for us. We woke up the next morning and I told her what had happened. We just blew it off and began our day. Well, the second night, we set up camp near the creek and things got a bit hairy. While sitting around the fire, we heard a very strange sound, something I've never heard before. The dogs began to growl and snarl, facing the woods north of us. We quickly drew arms and began to sweep the campsite. Found nothing, but the sound persisted around camp. It was like a snarling, gargling, sniffing sound. We didn't sleep that night. No matter how much we looked and checked, we could never find the source of the sound, and the dogs were restless the whole night. By the third night, we were very restless. When night fell, we sat by the fire with arms at our sides. We were going to stay up in shifts to keep watch, just in case. While I was asleep, I heard the dogs go off, and when I woke up, I saw my girlfriend standing with Zero at her feet and her Judge drawn. I quickly took arms at her back. Something had apparently run very rapidly behind the tent. She couldn't describe what it was. Then it ran by again. I caught a glance under the light of the fire behind us. It was big and very fast. Ran on all fours, but that's all I made out. It sounded like more than one creature this time. They weren't coyotes. Too big and much too fast. Heather spotted one again behind the tent and fired. We heard the nasty snarl again, and Wrangler broke away from me and gave chase. I loved my dog, but didn't dare go after him. I just called and called, but he didn't return. We stood there, guns drawn, for an hour. After she had fired, everything was quiet. Then we heard rustling. We had our sights on the sound, and Wrangler came out of the woods. He wasn't hurt, but he had blood on his back. After this, we decided to bug out at sunrise. We packed up and started hiking. We were about 2 days hike non-stop from the gate, and we were ready to do it. The third night, we didn't camp. We broke out the headlights and kept going. Whatever was in those woods was back, following us, but at a greater distance this time. They followed all night. That was one of the most intense hikes I've ever had. We hiked with our guns in front and the dogs in back. Whatever was following us wasn't stupid. It stuck to our sides, usually about 40 yards out into the woods, always out of sight. We stopped to rest for a few minutes around 4 a.m. They stopped too. From what we could hear, it sounded like maybe 3 things out there. They got closer when we stopped, and I thought I saw something and fired. I didn't hit anything, probably my mind playing games with me, but the shot scared them back to a much greater distance. By sunrise, they were gone again. We made it to the gate before dark and hightailed it out of there. We returned the next day on 4-wheelers and with several other people to have a look around. We went to the site of our second camp and found a blood trail from whatever the hell Heather had hit with a slug shot loaded in the Judge. The trail ran for about 200 yards before we lost it. We found nothing else and headed back before darkness caught us again. We never found out what they were, and no one had any experience like that on the property before. To this day, I try not to talk about it too much, because I even have trouble believing it sometimes. I try telling myself they were coyotes with mange or mutated or something, but Heather never let me believe myself. Not too many creatures out there can take a 410 slug and bleed that much without going down, especially not a coyote. All I know is that I won't camp on that property anytime soon. Story number 2. So my dad and I were hiking back in late November 2005 in a place called the UBC Research Forest north of Pitt Meadows, British Columbia, Canada. It's about 30 miles east and a bit north of Vancouver. It's on the edge of the mountains with several logging roads and trails. Anyway, the day was already getting late when we headed out. The weather was horrible. No wind, but there were showers and hail and slush. About 3 degrees. We were the only ones in the area hiking. The parking lot was empty both when we arrived and left. So, after about an hour of hiking randomly up logging roads and trails, we were a good several clicks into the area when we took a break by a small stream in a small gully. Anyway, we smelled this horrible scent, sort of skunkish, with a human and fish scent mixed in. Anyway, neither of us had ever smelt anything like this before, and we both have encountered very large animals out there on the coast because there was no wind, and we knew it was close. So we kept going along this hillside. Above us, about 50 feet, is an old overgrown logging slash. Below us, a thickly wooded slope. I could see maybe 100 feet down the slope. Then we got this feeling we were being followed. The forest became too silent. Even the local ravens didn't make a sound. And we smelled that scent another 2 times stronger, so we began hiking faster. As we came out of the small gully, we heard a crash. Spinning around, we raced back to the crest and looked back down. Something large and tall, easily taller than my dad, who is 6 feet, disappeared into the bush. We just caught a glimpse of dark brown. 'Cause neither of us was armed, we continued on at a full pace, knowing there was a logging road ahead. And then again we smelt this weird smell. We heard noises from the old logging meadow above us. Whatever it was moving very silently, yet the odd times it would break a branch or bump a small tree. Anyway, I've been followed by bear and cat before. Neither moved like this. It was way too silent to be either. Just for the record, grizzlies aren't in this area, but I've encountered them before too. After we rounded a bend in the slope, we heard movement again. It was on the lower side of us now, or so it seemed. About another few minutes went by and we heard it again, and smelled it again. Now it was moving on the upper side of us, just over a low ridge, maybe 100 feet away. By now you could see a logging road 100 or 200 feet ahead. Then this thing let out a cry. It sent a shiver down my spine. My dad, who I have never seen afraid before except the one time I was near death, which is another story, went cold. It sounded like the cross between a whoop, a human, and something unknown. It lasted for about 5 seconds. We turned and ran to the road. Running down the road, we passed the junction and continued heading south. I dropped something a few seconds later, about 200 feet past the junction. I stopped, turned, and picked it up. Amongst the trees, something tall and dark ducked out of sight. What it was, I haven't a clue, but it was tall and fairly slim. It was too dark to really tell what it was. It was about this time that it was getting close to nightfall, and so we ran back to the parking lot. Unfortunately, it snowed the next day, several inches. Otherwise, we would have gone back and searched for the evidence of this occurrence, which to this day mystifies the both of us. Nevertheless, this is the only time I've ever been scared in the woods. And to this day, I wish, despite the fear, that it would happen again, so I might see what this thing was. Third story. Several years ago, my dad and I went to a place called Gore's Landing on the St. Johns River in Florida. We used to get together every couple of months and camp out overnight and just hang out together. Well, this night, we decided to just take my van and sleep in it instead of setting up a tent and dragging all the gear out there. We were sitting around the fire just talking, and he said that he had not brought his gun. He never goes anywhere without his gun. I had left mine at the house because I figured he had brought his. Then neither one of us brought flashlights, so if something did happen, we couldn't see anything. We were sitting around the fire just talking when 50 feet or so behind, we heard something big moving through the bushes and palmettos. We both stopped and looked at each other, regretting not having a flashlight or a gun. I asked if he heard it too. I could tell by the look on his face he had. We've both grown up in the woods and know what a deer, armadillo, raccoon, or possum sounds like. This was not anything like that. The worst part was that it was just outside of our vision. Then it stopped. We were trying to see what it was but couldn't make anything out of the darkness. We started to walk toward the area, and then whatever it was took off beside the river and jumped across the boat landing area, a good 10 feet. I heard one foot hit the left side of the water, and then another foot hit the right side, and it took off into the woods. It was so big that you could feel the ground shake when it was running. It was definitely on 2 feet. I'm 6'2" and 230 pounds, and I'm not afraid to say I was scared shitless. My dad was pretty shook up, and we decided it was best to get in the van for the night. Later on that night, about 2 a.m., we were laying in our sleeping bags when the most god-awful scream woke us. I sat up and asked my dad if he heard it. He said, "What do you think?" I was looking out of the windows, trying to see what it was, but couldn't see anything. I was trying not to crap myself, but I decided I had to have a look at what it was. So I slowly opened the door to the van and stuck my head out to see if I could see anything. Nothing. So I got out to get a better view, and still nothing. So I figured while I was up, I would take a leak. I walked to the edge of the woods and started doing my business, when all of a sudden something hairy touched my leg. I about screamed like a little girl when I turned around. There was a big dog that rubbed the back of my leg. I have no idea where he came from. I almost peed all over the front of my shorts, trying to turn around and see what it was, and almost had a heart attack. My dad and I laughed hard about that part. But to this day, I will never know what ran through the woods, and I refuse to go out there without a gun. Again, till this day. Next story. Back in the 80s, I was something of an adventurer and did a lot of rock climbing and caving in West Virginia. Amazingly, with all the rough camping I did in West Virginia, nothing weird ever happened there. Near one cave we used to visit frequently, there was a property where a cult we loosely called the Lobelia Devil people met. We never met any of them, but I'm kind of glad we didn't. My story takes place far from West Virginia. One of my caving buddies and I went on a 3-week trip out west to do some caving and backpacking during this time. One night, in the Tetons near Driggs, Idaho, we were camped above the snow line on July 4th to the 5th. In the middle of the night, we were awakened by a really weird cry. crying, sobbing, snuffling, that type of sound, but in the distance. It was so unusual, we were wide awake instantly, listening intently for it to stop or go away. Instead, the sound gradually got closer and closer to our tent. It went on and on without pause, and got louder and louder. I mean, here we were at over 9,000 feet in our tent, in the dark with this creature coming at us. We weren't armed. Neither of us had been raised with guns and had never owned any. Our food and food prep clothing were in a bag hung from a tree, just like you're supposed to do. This damn thing came right up to the tent, literally within a foot of the fabric, still making that spooky noise. We were truly terrified by this time, figuring the tent fabric would part at any moment and we'd be grabbed and eaten by some hungry carnivore. The sound was very loud. It circled the tent, then it just left. Just like that. Still making the original sound, it headed upslope into the snow among the scrub pine, and eventually we stopped hearing it altogether. Needless to say, one or the other of us said to the other, "What the etc., you know what I mean, was that?" We asked locals in town about the animal we encountered, but there were no firm suggestions as to what it was. My buddy and I are both trained as scientists and are not superstitious at all. It certainly wasn't anything supernatural. It had to be some kind of critter like a skunk or possum, since it didn't seem to be that high off the ground, and it wasn't a bear. What it was, even today, I'm not really sure. Next story. When I was about 12 or 13, my dad and I were exploring an abandoned farm near where we lived in Maryland. My dad grew up in the area and knew a lot about the local families, and told me the farm was sold about 20 years before to the local sand and gravel company for surface mining. We got to the front door, which was slightly ajar, about 4 or 5 inches, but was held closed by vines and brush. We cut away enough to get through and went inside. The interior was as if a family had simply walked away, leaving everything, but it had been ransacked. We looked through old papers and documents dated early 1900s, then decided after 20 minutes or so to have a look upstairs. Dad led the way with me close behind. About 3/4 of the way up the stairs, a bedroom door slammed shut so hard it sounded like a gunshot. I don't remember whether it was me or Dad who made it out of that house first, but it was a close race. We never went back, and we still laugh about it. Thinking back, it was probably just a vagrant, but the house was very far off the road, with no visible access as the driveway was so overgrown it couldn't be seen from the road. It still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end when I think about it. Next story. I grew up in a rural area and loved spending hours alone in the woods. Years ago I moved to Chicagoland and wanted to do some volunteer work at one of the preserves. After talking with the rangers for some time, I finally asked them, "This looks like a busy preserve. All the parking areas are full. So what are all those men doing hanging around their cars in the parking lot?" Need I answer that? It wasn't until a couple of years later that the cultural point was driven home. I've never had any fear of going alone on day hikes and considered myself pretty savvy in dealing with the unexpected. I'd go up to one of our preserves on a blustery fall day. You know, the kind with a holdover of summer sunshine peeking through flat, heavy gray clouds. I thought I'd walk along the preserves road a ways to a pond. And it's funny, but I remember thinking maybe it's not such a good idea being out here alone. Down a short hill the road turned, and approaching me from a distance was a red pickup, driving real slow. Something wasn't right. I didn't know if it was the pickup or whatever might be hiding in the chest-high grasses. But I've worked with some large animals, and one of the things you do when in a sticky spot with a strange, riled-up critter is keep your cool, stand up straight, set your shoulders back, and tip your chin up, no matter how shaky your insides get. It's not really something you think of. It just sort of happens without thinking. So, the pickup's getting closer, and I've got this don't mess with me body language going on, and the pickup passes. and the driver staring at me behind a curly beard, and his stare is intense. The wind is tossing the grasses, and the world is silent. Mine was the only car in the parking lot. Where am I going to go? There's a path a few feet away. It leads into the prairie. To where? It struck me there was an RV park just out of view. 30 seconds later, I was on the path, a wall of briars tangling the edge between the grasses and the mow, and then the truck stops. I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing the brake lights, and I ran. I'm safe today because the good Lord protected me. After growing up in a rural area, why would I ever think maybe it's not such a good idea being out here alone? There was no reason I can see to have had that thought when I drove up that day, and I sincerely hope I've learned to recognize that word of warning. Or was it truly coincidence that the trail was where it was when I needed it, and that the idea of the RV park came so suddenly to mind? I'd only been to the park once before. Next story. My husband and I were out in Southern California for a brief visit, and he thought he'd show me the sights. This preserve is a well-known migratory bird resting place, and is lush and green with cottonwoods, eucalyptus, native Washingtonian palms, and thick underbrush. An underground aquifer runs into a fault line and has created this natural oasis in the desert. So I'm oohing and awing at all the bizarre spiky plants. Even the leafy plants there have thorns. And he says, "Let's see where this trail over here goes." We follow the trail under a broadleaf canopy, and a bridge takes us over a slow-moving body of water. The water is crystal clear and sparkles as it moves past rushes and over the gently rippled sandy bottom. The air was pleasant and cool under there, and we pointed out things of interest to one another. A bird, a dragonfly, some large tracks in the sand and the shallows. The prints where the animals had crossed the bridge were mostly dry. The trail forked, and we took the lesser, more intriguing branch through the denser underbrush. The pavement ended abruptly, but the path continued, narrower, hemmed in by leafy shrubs and the sharp-edged leaves. The canopy dropped, and we crouched. But we were almost definitely on a well-worn people trail, not an animal trail. It was all very different in this jungle-like oasis, and we could hear other tourists jabbering on, just like ourselves, not far off. Up ahead, we saw sunlight, and we were chatting away noisily about this and that and who knows what. Sure enough, 10 feet more, and we are through, and the place widened into an airy wood. Except there's this bee's nest in the ground that we have to cross. The bees haven't regarded our arrival yet, and I'm chatting on about the size of the bees, but my husband repeats himself to stand very still. I'm thinking, is it the bees? I've heard they have killer bees in Southern California, and I feel the creepiest feeling that something, a big something, was watching us. He wasn't talking about the bees. It was watching him. It made his skin crawl. It was watching me, watching my back. I swear the thing was behind me, but all we could see were the dense shrubs and their prickly leaves. We very quietly retraced our path. Back on the pavement, we let our guard down a little. The goosebumps subsided. How silly of us, we said to each other, to have gotten each so worked up like scared little children around a campfire. We followed the main trail as it swung its course through the park, but now our comments were hushed. We reminded ourselves that nothing was there, yet our nervous glances searched the shadows beyond. What kind of harm could befall us in such a pampered, paved, well-visited locale? We rode this cajoling roller coaster for a while, the hair prickling our skin 1 minute, and the next we were giddy with relief. A fellow tourist up ahead had his camera pointed at us. 3 small excited children strained to see in the direction we came from. "Did you see it? Did you see it?" he asked us, as hyper as his kids. "It was this big." He pantomimed its length. "And it stood over there," and he pointed to where we had just walked from. "It paused and went that way." He pointed to an area the path had curved around. He pointed directly to where we had stood, trapped between the thorn brush and the bees. "Not more than 5 minutes ago. Surely you saw the mountain lion." "No, we didn't." We looked at each other. My husband said to him, "Maybe now is not a good time to be out here with small children. That's a really bold cat to walk in front of you like that. You know, cats have been known to eat people." "Nah, not here. I'm going to get its picture this time, and the kids got to see a real-life cat. This is great." We left him and his family there. The cat wasn't hungry that day. Later that same year, a woman was mauled and killed at that park. It's a nice park. Lots of spiky leaf plants, lots of wildlife. If you ever have the chance to do some birding there, by all means, go. But keep your eyes open. Next story. A family member of mine owns about 200 acres of land in eastern Tennessee. Ever since I was a kid, me, my dad, uncles and cousins always went out there to camp, hang out, and target shoot. Well, we normally cheated a bit and camped out in my dad's truck bed instead of a tent because the truck had a topper. When I was about 13, I wanted to try out my dad's new tent, so he set it up and we tried it out that night. So we had a great day and everyone headed to bed. In our tent was me, my dad, and my cousin. We all eventually fell asleep. About halfway through the night, I woke up because I heard something outside of the tent. As I'm lying in the tent, I started to hear coyotes yipping and barking. We left the fire burning, so by the light of it, I was able to see coyotes' shadows walking by the fire. By now, I'm wide awake and freaked out. I closed my eyes and tried to ignore them, but then I started to feel something touching my side. I opened my eyes and I saw a coyote's shadow right beside me. The thing started poking me in the side with its nose. I snapped my eyes shut. It kept poking me but then just left. I didn't hear anything the rest of the night, but I didn't go to sleep. The next morning I asked my dad and cousin if they had seen what I had. They said they had heard them in the distance, but they never got close. It still freaks me out to this day, and now I always sleep with a weapon a little closer. Another time, on the same land, me and my dad got this great idea to go out for a little night hike to a cave where my cousins were at. So we started walking down this trail, and then it hit us. It's dark. It's really freaking dark and really quiet. Never in my life had I seen my dad scared, but when my body got rigid, I saw his did too. Then I saw him put his hand on his gun. I got really scared. After a second, he just said, "Run," and we both tore off down this path and bolted back to the truck and the fire. The next day, we found something really scary. No joke. We found 10, and yes, we counted 10 dead dogs, all in a big pile, right near the trail me and my dad were walking down. Don't know why they were out there, and we didn't stick around. We left later that day, and I haven't been to that part of the land since. Next story. This happened years ago in a place called Lone Pine in California. I was with my family at a friend's cabin. One day, I was climbing on some large rocks and turned and sat on a large rock and looked down the road. I could see a person coming up the road and started to get an uneasy feeling. I decided to watch this person and see what he did. Shortly, he looked up towards me and then off to my left and stopped, and it looked like he was watching me. So, he's still ways off, and yet this creepy feeling is getting more intense. And he stopped and looked up again at me, and he started running up the road, and then I can see it's my younger brother. So I don't know why this voice in my head is screaming, "Danger!" And then my brother dropped on one knee and fired his rifle at me. I flipped over backwards and started crawling in the dirt. He fired a few more, and I crawled out of the rocks and ran to the cabin. So my brother comes running up and he's asking, "Are you all right?" And I reply, "Only because you missed me, asshole." Then he says, "I was shooting at the monster behind you. I don't know what it was, but it moved around the rocks towards you, and I only saw part of it, and then it was on the rock above you and started reaching, and it was huge, and I knew you couldn't hear me shouting at you to run. This place was supposedly haunted. Everyone that I know who ever stayed there has a creepy story to tell. If you are from Lone Pine, I'll bet you've heard of this place. Last story. If any are familiar with the Edisto River in South Carolina, then you know it's a fairly swampy and slow-moving, especially when you're miles away from the tidal portion. Some friends that I have known since high school and I decided to go on an overnight kayaking trip. The place was to launch in Dorchester County at my friend's river house, which is perhaps 50 miles from the ocean, and to go as long as we could. Of course, this wasn't much since none of us were experienced kayakers. Anyway, we set out in the morning and paddled all day along the narrow river, taking brief breaks to eat and rest. There are some nice sandy river banks on the river, but we didn't want to make camp on sand since it's pretty miserable if it gets in your tent. However, it was starting to get dark, so we figured it was necessary to stop at the next bank so we could set up camp with some daylight. So we stopped at the next bank around 8 p.m. and found the clearing past the sand. There were dozens of animal bones, including skulls, scattered all over the place. But with night fast approaching, it gave us limited options, so we decided to clear the area of bones and pitch the tent. The bones were odd for two reasons: the amount of them there and the fact that none of the other 6 or so riverbanks we rested had any. Still, nothing too odd, of course. That night, around 2 a.m., I woke up with a feeling of intense unease. Wide awake, I sat up in that tent and instinctively grabbed my machete. As I listened intently, I could make out a woman's shrill voice drifting in from the direction of the river. It sounded like she was screaming, but I couldn't make out any words. I woke the others up, and they heard her as well. Of course, the water could have been carrying the sound from someone's river house from down the river, but that was just downright creepy place. I have no explanation from that intense feeling of danger I got as I woke up. My friend's theory is that occultists used the bank we unwittingly camped on to sacrifice animals. Ridiculous sounding, I realize, but who knows? Thankfully, we were so exhausted from the day of paddling, we were able to fall asleep a half hour or so later.